Sega once again makes us all say, oh, great, sports. It's Segaiden episode, 44? After two pleasantly robust entries in the Great Sports franchise with Great Baseball and the Japan-only Great Golf, we have another arrival in the Great franchise. But any hope that Great Football might be worthy of its title will be quickly dashed once you realize that its alternate title is SportsPad Football. Yes, the SportsPad is back again, though not actually for Great Football. Bizarrely, Sega released this game twice in the span of a few weeks under its two alternate titles. Great Football arrived in US stores in July 1987, while SportsPad Football hit in August 1987. Despite sporting distinct titles and unique box illustrations, the cartridges for Great and SportsPad Football contain almost entirely identical program code and graphics, playing alike except for the interface. Great Football plays with a standard gamepad and doesn't seem to respond well to SportsPad inputs, while SportsPad Football doesn't play with the pack-in controller, only the peripheral with which it shares its name. I have to imagine that for anyone who can manage to track down a SportsPad that hasn't broken down with age and abuse, SportsPad Football amounts to a pretty good time. What little I was able to experience of the game via SportsPad before it glitched out entirely reminded me of one of the all-time great coin-op football sims, Atari's Football. Debuting back in 1978, Atari built football around a rollerball control interface that turned a preposterously simplistic game, one with graphics consisting entirely of black and white X's and O's, into a full-body workout as players spun the trackball with all their strength to cause their little virtual sportsmen to dash around the field. So far as I'm aware, SportsPad Football is the only football sim of the Master System's console generation to even attempt to chase that particular dragon. So, credit where it's due and all that. Sadly, due to my continued difficulties in finding a working SportsPad, I had to settle for playing the more mundane Great equivalent to the peripheral-focused release. Great Football is a weird one. From what I can tell, it only allows you to play a full offense and defense game if you select two-player mode. Experienced solo, it always makes you play an offense-only game, similar to the arcade and Famicom versions of Irem's 10-Yard Fight. Even more curiously, it only seems to let you play the fourth quarter of a game in progress, in which you enter the final portion of the game with no points, while the rival team has several touchdowns on the scoreboard. The precise gap between sides varied in each new game I began, whether the CPU picks the score randomly or based on some algorithm determined by the teams you select for yourself in the computer, I couldn't say. In any case, you can play with either AFC or NFC teams, except not really. Sega didn't pony up for proper NFL licensing, so you don't see any city names, and the team names amount to legally distinct, non-infringing intimations of professional league franchises, like the Bombers and Beavers. The single-player game begins with a kickoff, which you can receive and run back to determine the field position of your first proper possession. With each play, you can select from 8, sometimes 9 different play options, which the computer highlights one by one from start to finish. This is a little annoying, since it means that selecting each play takes about 10 seconds as the menu ticks through all the possible choices. But this seems to be aimed at keeping offensive and defensive selections a secret during competitive play. The interface doesn't acknowledge your selection, so unless the other player happens to glance at or hear your button press, you'll enter each play not knowing one another's precise tactics. Though of course, this doesn't matter in versus CPU play, so again, it's a little annoying in solo mode. More annoying is the fact that Great Football does such an unbelievably poor job of managing a large-scale team sport. For the most part, you only control your quarterback, and I use the term control very loosely. Sometimes your QB responds quickly to your inputs, and sometimes you can hammer the D-pad and action buttons, and the dude will just stand there until he gets sacked, refusing to run or toss the ball. When you do manage to pass, you can really only throw in cardinal directions and at diagonals, and the ball always seems to fly a set distance. Passing does not incorporate any sort of auto-correction or aim assist that I can determine, so ensuring a proper completion means picking a play, determining where your receivers will move to, and then timing your throw so that it will cross a receiver's path. I mean, yeah, in a sense that's how the actual sport works. It's just that in the actual sport, the quarterback isn't limited to targeting 3 specific spots on the field. If you fail to make progress before the end of 4th down, either by rushing or passing, the game doesn't hand the ball to the CPU team. Instead, you immediately begin your next possession with a fresh 1st down, 10 yards back from your last position. If the CPU manages to push you all the way to your end zone, the opposing team gains points. However, if you manage to score, you earn a touchdown, attempt a field goal, and start the process all over again. Difficult as it is to complete a pass correctly, once you do get the ball into a receiver's hands, it's pretty easy to carry it for a touchdown. The CPU rarely sends more than a single defender after the receiver, and you can dodge their tackles by breaking at a diagonal once they move close enough to make the attempt. So yeah, it's a strange game. Not bad necessarily, but a far cry from a full-scale football simulation. And the choice to drop dual releases of the same game weeks apart is by far the most bizarre decision we've seen where Master System is concerned. Still, it's not like the US console market offered a lot of other choices in terms of football sims at this point. If you wanted something for a current generation console, that is, if you didn't want to muck around in the bargain bin wasteland that was the discount Atari 2600 market, your options consisted of either 10-yard fight or great football. Or, sports pad football, whatever. The Master System's 3rd title to be based on an external media property arrives, and it's based on a Sylvester Stallone property. Between this and Rambo, that's 2 out of 3. Clearly, someone in the C-suite was a Sly Stallone fan. You certainly can't blame Sega for going back to this particular well. The company arguably had its first real home console design success with Champion Boxing for SG-1000, a game so good-looking that they converted the console hardware into an arcade cabinet in order to distribute Champion Boxing as a coin-op title. And if you're going to make a game in a genre as niche as boxing, would you rather attempt to sell people on an original property, or rely on a worldwide blockbuster franchise name like Rocky? When people in the 80s thought boxing, they invariably thought of either Rocky or Mike Tyson. And, well, Nintendo had the Tyson brand locked in, so Rocky it was. Besides, Rocky as a video game property already had quite a bit of precedent. Europe had seen multiple microcomputer games based on the films by 1987, and Coleco had almost enjoyed a hit with Rocky Super Action Boxing for ColecoVision, which sported some of the best visuals on the system. I say almost because Coleco's game had the poor fortune to arrive just as the American console market began to collapse like a bad souffle, taking down ColecoVision's fortunes with it. Rocky for the Master System bears more than a passing resemblance to Coleco's game, rather than to the European computer titles, which you could easily mistake for monochromatic demakes of Nintendo's Punch-Out with their first-person viewpoints and rubber-faced opponents. No, this game plays through a side-view perspective in which Rocky and his opponents duke it out mano a mano. While this setup lends itself to simpler play than the forced three-quarters perspective of Data East's Ring King, it also makes for a much nicer-looking game. You could definitely make a case that Rocky looks better than anything else on Master System to this point, or in fact, that it visually trumps any other console release ever seen prior to July 1987. Graphics don't count for everything, of course, and Rocky could afford to look great since there's not actually that much to it. Most of the action takes place in a single-screen fixed space, where you face off against only 3 opponents, and nothing much happens by way of animation in the backgrounds. This means that Rocky lacks the weird background tile image class that dragged down Space Harrier's visuals. In terms of salesmanship, Rocky made for a heck of a Master System pitch, a gorgeous-looking game with fluid animation based on a recognizable film franchise. The NES would see a pair of boxing titles by the year's end, with the aforementioned Ring King and Punch-Out, and brilliant though the latter may have been, it did take a distinctly cartoonish approach to the concept of boxing. Rocky, on the other hand, foregrounded a more realistic take, which tends to sell better to American audiences. But since the game sticks to the text of the films, you only see Rocky face off against Apollo Creed, or Carl Weathers, fresh from his supporting role in Rambo, Clubber Lang, and Ivan Drago. Each fight plays out through multiple rounds and continues until you either score a knockout against your opponent or else win by technical judgment based on the ratings displayed between rounds. It's pretty standard fare in that each boxer has his own stamina meter, which wears down as they take punches and recharges slightly between rounds. A knockdown takes you to a dramatic view of the afflicted boxer as he struggles to rise again before the count of 10, an act that becomes more difficult with each fall. In the ring, you can only move back and forth, although Rocky moves a bit of his own volition, dancing forward and backward based on your punches and blocks. Button 2 attacks while Button 1 defends, and the exact nature of the actions you perform with these inputs appears to be highly contextual and automated based on a variety of other factors. In basic terms, your attack button consists of a 4-hit combo: punch, 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 heavy blow. You can attack high or low, for example striking high a few times before delivering a low body blow, while your opponent defends their face, leaving their abdomen exposed. You don't really seem to have a lot of control over how you deliver punches though, as the focus of Rocky's attacks sometimes seems to line up with the direction you press on the D-pad, and sometimes doesn't. The same goes for defending. You can block high or low or duck, but the exact nature of each action you take appears to vary according to the whims of the CPU. When you add this tenuous link between inputs and actions to the limited 2D perspective and lack of computer opponents, you end up with a boxing game that offers very little in the way of strategy or substance. In fact, there's really not much to Rocky's boxing sequences at all, which is probably why Sega's development staff decided to lean into a key facet of the Rocky franchise by incorporating a series of minigames to train between fights. The Rocky films were less about the boxing matches and more about the human drama that happened between the fights, and that included Rocky Balboa's struggles to keep himself in fighting shape. The game plays this up by giving you events to undertake between matches, such as smashing up a punching bag or training on the speed bag. These aren't simply mindless diversions. I mean, they are, but they have a purpose. The better your performance in the minigames, the more capable Rocky's performance in the subsequent matches. Whack the speed bag in a blur and Rocky will go into the Clubber Lang fight juiced up and better able to counter Mr. T's blinding speed. Which means that Rocky is another one of those games that works remarkably well with the sports pad, despite not explicitly being designed or designated for it. Since you barely move in the ring, the trackball's inconsistent performance doesn't have the opportunity to become a detriment, and if you turn on the auto-fire feature, you can absolutely dominate the minigames. That said, even with the sports pad advantage, Rocky follows standard Sega design rubric and becomes crazy difficult about halfway through, which is to say with the second of 3 fights. Clubber Lang hits harder and faster than Apollo Creed, and even juiced up with max speed bag buffs. It's difficult to break through his offense and land a heavy blow that will knock him off his feet. I couldn't actually reach Drago, but I have to assume that he's even more ridiculously powerful. I'm reluctant to say that Rocky is a poor game or an unreasonable one because it's not like I put in the hours to master its mechanics. I have to assume that it includes some systems and designs that make its control scheme less random and computer controlled than it first appears. But this does seem to be yet another Master System title created in an arcade mindset, obscuring brevity and a lack of content with ferociously high difficulty. But for a little while, it was the coolest boxing game on the US market, a claim that would vanish a few months later with the arrival of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! But hey, that's just being true to the source material. What was the message of Rocky, if not that victory is ultimately fleeting despite coming at a terrible cost? Next time on Segaiden, we go from a literal Rocky to a more figurative one.